You are listening to Climate Now. I'm Katherine Gorman.
And I'm James Lawler. In another episode, we spoke with Dr. Eric Larson of Princeton University and explored the pathways by which the United States could become net zero, that is, reach net zero emissions by 2050. But the reality is that it's not just the United States or any single entity, country, corporation that needs to achieve net zero. It is the whole world. And while historically the United States has contributed the most atmospheric greenhouse gases through fossil fuel emissions, today the biggest emitter by far is China. So, to understand the direction that we're going globally in terms of reducing emissions, we have to understand what China is doing and what their future looks like from an emissions and energy transition standpoint.
Precisely, James. And so we had the opportunity to talk with three experts about how China is designing its climate policy and what that policy actually is. We spoke with Huang Zhong. He's been consulting for over 20 years in the clean energy technologies and sustainable investing and finance spaces for regional governments, corporations, and ministries in the US and China.
We also had a conversation with Professor Joanna Lewis, who is director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program at Georgetown University, and she has been working on international climate policy with a focus on China for 2 decades. We also spoke with Laura Edwards, who's program coordinator for China policy with the National Security and International Policy team at the Center for American Progress.
So, for context, in September 2020, President Xi Jinping announced that China would be pursuing a 30-60 plan. China would reach peak emissions output before 2030 and reach net zero emissions by 2060. But the question is, how is China going to achieve this goal? In theory, the answer to that is going to be laid out in China's 5-year plans. Their government roadmap outlining national economic plans that includes projections for everything, including developing a green economy. So to start, Johnny gave us a breakdown on what a 5-year plan actually is and how they fit into the framework of national policy development.
Yeah, the full name of the 5-year plan is called the Outline of the 5-year Plan for National Economic and Social Development. It's just a long name, but in short, we call it 5-year plan. And an important part of China's national economic plan is to make plans for major national infrastructure projects, the distribution of productivity, and the important proportions of the national economy, and to set goals and directions for the development of the national economy. So as far as where the 5-year plan got started, it's actually got started on January 1st of 1953. So almost like 70 years ago. China announced its first 5-year plan, and the purpose of that, in Chairman Mao's statement, is that China could produce no more than tables and chairs, teapots, and the rice. But we need to make tractors, cars, tanks, and airplanes. So that symbolized the situation back then that China does not have an industrial infrastructure in place. And it needs one in order to give people hope and strengthen the Communist Party's newly gained power to rule the country.
So the Chinese Communist Party invented this system where every 5 years there's a new 5-year plan. And the purpose is to provide an outline for the country on how the economy is going to run. Johnny also told us that this national 5-year plan outline works as the basis by which local or smaller governments structure their policies to build the complete national plan.
Local governments and each ministries and the provincial and the municipal level governments, down even to like some township governments, they are making their own local regional plans. So all the plans, local version of plans combined together becomes the nation's final 5-year plan. So you're going to be able to see the 5-year plan by the end of next year.
So the most recent 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan, was released in March of 2021, and it outlines China's energy ambitions for the next 5 years. So looking at these short-term goals, it could give us a sense of whether China is on track to reach its promise of net zero emissions by 2060. To dig into this, we turn to Joanna and Laura, who recently authored a report specifically assessing China's energy and climate goals. When we got a chance to sit down with them, our first question was about what is actually in this 14th five-year plan as it relates to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We asked Laura to start.
The 5-year plan sort of laid out a series of targets on things like carbon intensity, energy intensity, a target for the non-fossil energy consumption by 2025, because this covers the period of up till 2025. And then we're expecting that in consecutive 14th five-year plans coming out from individual ministries, which also complements sort of this overarching central government 14th five-year plan, to have also specific targets for things like hydro power, wind power, solar power. But just to walk through some of the specifics on carbon intensity, they expect an 18% decrease from 2020 levels, which is actually the same as the goal that they set in the 13th five-year plan. And on energy intensity, they're looking at a 13.5% decrease from 2020, which is less ambitious than what they set in the 13th five-year plan. So on those two really key goals, we're actually seeing the first one be set at the same level, and the second one, energy intensity, to be less ambitious than what they had set in the previous five-year plan.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, make sure I'm understanding properly. When you say set at the same level, what you're saying set at the same percent reduction, right? Not the
Yes.
same level of
Yes.
energy intensity, or not the same
Yes.
level of carbon intensity.
The same expected percentage decrease.
Mm-hmm.
When we were really hoping to see something more ambitious in this 14th five-year plan. So particularly given, you asked about signals from high-level officials, Xi Jinping had set out last year a target for China to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, and then also set out a series of complementary goals to update China's nationally determined contribution by 2030, although that has not yet been formalized in an updated NDC. So these goals are making sort of modest and incremental changes, but given that there are not strict caps on carbon emissions, there's just a carbon intensity goal. There's no absolute energy consumption cap in the five-year plan, which is a notable omission since that was included previously. There's no halt on building new coal plants or a cap on total power capacity, which was also included in previous 14th five-year plans. We're really looking at these as sort of less ambitious than what we would have hoped to see for the next 5 years. So it's really, what is not in this 14th five-year plan is just as important as what's in the 14th five-year plan.
Can you comment on why that might be? That is, why this five-year plan is less ambitious than the last?
Sure. Yeah. China is the largest greenhouse gas producer in the world by far. That's more than the US, EU, and India combined. So, as we point out in the report, the world really needs the Chinese government to take ambitious and urgent action on climate change and urgent action to reduce emissions and decarbonize. But unfortunately, we're seeing emissions in China grow at their fastest rate in a decade, particularly as the country comes out of the pandemic, with their economic recovery really focusing on heavy industry and having a surge in energy use. Previously we had thought that Chinese coal consumption had peaked. Many experts had agreed on that, and that was sort of what we were hoping for. But unfortunately, we've seen coal consumption reach its highest in 2020. So even though we would hope that China can play an increasing leadership role in the climate response, we're sort of seeing all of that trend upwards. I don't know, Joanna, if you have other thoughts.
China still relies on coal for the vast majority of its electricity use, its total energy production. There are these very concerning trends in the past year, with 2020 coal consumption reaching a new record high after years of slowing growth. And at the same time, when you sort of look at coal versus renewables, China dominates the world in the deployment of clean energy technologies. And when you look at new power plants being built in China, so not the kind of existing fleet, but what's being built on an incremental basis each year, China is building far more wind and solar plants than any other type of technologies. 2020, China installed over 70 gigawatts of new wind turbines, 50 gigawatts almost of solar, compared with under 40 gigawatts of new coal and under
Mhm.
15 gigawatts of new hydropower, and gas and nuclear are even smaller.
If they're building all of this renewable infrastructure, then why is there still this dependence on coal? Why isn't China leaning more into the new clean energy plants that they're building?
Politically, it's just still an uphill battle to convince large, powerful state-owned enterprises that renewables are the future. And China's making huge investments in research and development, and it's amazing what they've accomplished in a short time. But the political economy of China's coal sector, the jobs, the kind of concern about being able to just rely on these new industries to keep people employed, to maintain political stability, economic growth, I think is just still something that the leadership is trying to get comfortable with. What's really challenge about decarbonization for China, sort of again compared to the United States, is that industry is still a huge segment of their economy, right? I mean, it's still 66% of total energy consumption in China. They are still manufacturing a huge amount of the world's cement, iron, and steel. And so that's a really different challenge to decarbonizing the residential sector, commercial sector, or even the transportation sector, which are, still much smaller shares of emissions in China, although of course growing rapidly.
So we are really hearing all of the challenges that China is facing to build a renewable energy sector. Are the goals laid out in the 14th five-year plan even achievable? That is, maybe you can comment on how likely it is for a particular goal in a five-year plan to be achieved in general. What the dynamics are, by which such a goal actually becomes reality.
Well, the 5-year plans can send, I think, really important high level signals, all the way down from Beijing to the local level. And a strong target can mobilize local action because these national targets get translated into local targets, and local officials actually are held accountable for meeting them. We see this with energy intensity targets, carbon intensity targets. So, there's beyond the targets themselves, though, there's a wide range of mechanisms in place to try to ensure the targets are met. Financial incentives, penalties, and increasingly market-based mechanisms. For example, China's new national carbon emissions trading market, which was is finally now up and running. It's been sort of gradually phased in over the last few years. And it's a lot of these levers that, are disseminated throughout the entire country and then go into meeting these national targets.
It turns out these more local governments and enterprises might be the key for how China is going to meet their clean energy targets. In our discussion with Johnny, he helped clarify what takes place at the local level in response to the national five-year plans.
Normally, the regional five-year plans will be a little bit more than what the national plan asks them to do. So, for example, the national plan for carbon emissions is that's going to be reaching carbon peaking by 2030. But in the case of like Shanghai, they claim we will reach carbon peaking by 2025. So that would be, instead of the 15th five-year plan to achieve that carbon peaking goal, they're going to achieve that goal in the 14th five-year plan. So each one is a little bit different, but each one try to, outcompete their peers in other regions for various reasons.
Can you explain the motivation behind this kind of competition dynamic between the different regions to achieve the goals described in the five-year plan outline more quickly? What's the incentive for doing that?
Very good question. First and foremost, for local officials to outcompete their peers in other regions or premises, of course, for political reasons, for their own political ambitions or promotions. But that's one factor. The other factor is, I think, the Communist Party does realize that in order to solidify the power's position, it needs to do something for good for the general public to gain more support. In the case in point would be, the pandemic, how the government's being able to put the pandemic under tight control in a relatively short time span and still able to get it under control and achieve, economic growth even during the pandemic and positive economic growth during the pandemic. So I think the political dynamics would be one, of course, I want to get promoted for higher positions. But two, it's also, to get favorable, public opinions from the public, which also help them to promote their political position in the party.
In Laura and Joanna's review of China's 14th Five-Year Plan and 3060 climate goals, they referenced a 2020 report from Tsinghua University's Institute of Climate Change and Sustainable Development that states that energy intensity would need to be reduced by 14 to 15%, and then carbon intensity would need to decrease by about 20% during the 14th Five-Year Plan period in order to achieve the 1.5 degree scenario. That is a bit more than the 14th Five-Year Plan outline, which again has a target of 13.5% decrease in energy intensity and an 18% decrease in carbon intensity.
Compared to the previous 13th Five-Year Plan, those two goals are also not really more ambitious. We're kind of seeing the same levels. So they're both sort of key examples of how the Chinese government is setting moderate targets that will allow it to continue focusing on economic growth and kind of delay the major overhaul of its energy system that would need to happen to transition to clean energy.
And I think that then leads to a question, which is how aware do you think Chinese leadership is of the problems of putting off action on emissions for another 5 to 10 years, Joanna?
I mean, it sort of gets back to what we were talking about earlier with this trade-off between economic growth and responding to climate change. And so I think the leadership is certainly aware, but sort of not fully bought into, whether you can maintain this, steady economic growth, which the leadership really believes is just crucial to maintaining political stability in the country, which is their central goal of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that, climate policy is important in China. I don't want to say that it's not, but, I think that right now you see China really focused on, this economic stimulus, particularly coming out of the pandemic, that's overwhelmingly focused on shoring up polluting heavy industry, despite the fact that they have these very ambitious climate goals on paper. And so I think it's just, it's hard to see right now. We know what the models, like, Laura said, sort of tell us where we need to be, and we know where we are today. And so it's really unclear how China gets from point A to point B. If China waits until after 2030 to make the most dramatic emissions reductions, to get online with the mid-century carbon neutrality goals, it will require just extremely rapid transformation that would be unprecedented. No other country would have been able to decarbonize at that rate, and therefore, extremely costly, right? And so it's just not necessarily the smartest strategy to kind of keep putting this off. Again, all the economic models, tell us you want to do this sort of gradually. You don't want to necessarily shut down plants, before the end of their useful lifetime. You don't want to be investing in technologies that are just going to become these sunk costs, and you're going to waste the investment from it. So I think this is just a real active debate right now in China.
Joanna and Laura did note that despite this risk of creating significant sunk costs by relying on the existing coal infrastructure now to sustain economic development for the next 5 to 10 years, on paper, China seems to be committed to reaching their climate goals. We asked Johnny to give us some perspective on that. And what exactly is China's motivation for reaching net zero by 2060 in spite of their existing emphasis on coal?
It's actually hard to imagine why China wouldn't want to be a global climate action leader. So although the President Xi's pledge to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 surprised many, but I believe this reflects China's understanding of the importance of climate action and the opportunities that it presents. So first, I think the climate change is a common challenge to every country, especially for the two largest economies. So by working on the climate change together, China and the US finally will have something in common, during this extremely polarizing period of international relations. John Kerry took a trip to Shanghai in April to meet with his Chinese counterpart. And example of such promising, partnership. So climate change and sustainability are less sensitive compared to other national security matters. So China, the US, the EU have already expressed the shared interest in dealing with this planetary crisis together. But that's more general. But second, I think money talks. Global investors are allocating more and more capitals towards solving, climate change. So China could use its climate agenda to attract meaningful and long-term foreign investors. In fact, China climbed to the #1 ranking globally, attracting foreign direct investment, or FDI, of 163 billion in 2020 during a raging, global pandemic, and knocking off the US, which attracted 134 billion off the first spot. So that's #2, money talks.
The idea that action on climate change is an opportunity to have something in common with the US or have some positive US-China relations is a really interesting one. We heard from Laura and Joanna on ways that the US or other global leaders like Europe could build a more collaborative path forward with China on reducing emissions.
I agree that I don't think climate change can just be addressed in a vacuum. I think that there's a range of geopolitical issues, right, that are affecting the US-China relationship right now. And while climate change cooperation, can and has been continuing even throughout the Trump administration, particularly among scientists and researchers, I think that it's really important to think about, how we can use climate change to actually address a lot of these geopolitical issues, whether it's trade barriers to renewable energy technologies, which affects supply chains around the world, the availability and environmental impacts of critical materials, the role of overseas finance of coal. I mean, these are all issues that are, broader than just climate change, right? But, they're economic issues, they're security issues, but are just going to be very important in order to have real engagement with China and to move the ball forward on the global response. Together, I think it's clear that the US and China, or the climate G2, as we call them, they can either, be instrumental to mobilizing global action, or discord between the countries can slow progress.
It seems like as though both the risks and the potential for China to become, a game changer in our global path to net zero emissions are just huge.
Absolutely. And it's just an incredible example of how complex developing a sustainable energy future really is. It's not just identifying the technology to solve the problem, but finding productive ways to integrate that with national and local economies, with global politics, international relations.
And I think that our conversations also really highlight the fact that this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. That you're going to need to have different approaches for reaching climate goals in different countries that really work with the cultures, the economies, the governments of those regions. And a huge thank you to Johnny, Joanna, and Laura for taking the time to talk with us about all of this.
That's it for this episode of Climate Now. You can head over to our website, climatenow.com, to sign up for our newsletter to be the first to hear about live conversations with experts or new video releases and podcast releases. Thanks so much, and we hope you can join us for our next conversation.